Step into 1966, school in the 60s like you were really there. The morning of September 15, 1966, arrived in Brooksville, Illinois, with the kind of crisp clarity that made everything seem possible. Tommy Carter stood at his bedroom window, watching Mrs. Henderson across the street shake out her kitchen rugs with the methodical precision of a woman who had been performing this same ritual every Tuesday for 23 years. The maple trees lining Elm Street were just beginning their slow transformation from summer green to the amber and scarlet that would soon paint the entire town in autumn's familiar palette. From downstairs came the comforting symphony of morning, the percolator bubbling its caffeinated promise, the Chicago Tribune rustling as his father Frank turned pages with the deliberate care of a man who believed newspapers contained everything important about the world, and his mother Helen humming Moon River, while she prepared what she called a proper breakfast for a growing boy. Tommy adjusted the collar of his white Oxford shirt, ran a pocket comb through hair still damp with Brylcreem, and studied his reflection with the critical eye of someone who understood that high school was theater, and every day required getting the costume exactly right. At 16, he possessed that peculiar combination of earnestness and insecurity that marked him as unmistakably American, unmistakably teenage, and unmistakably caught between who he was and who he dreamed of becoming. "Tommy, eggs are getting cold." Helen's voice carried up the stairs with the authority of a woman who had been calling children to breakfast since the Eisenhower administration. "Coming, Ma." He grabbed his letter jacket, the one he'd earned through sheer persistence on JV baseball rather than any particular athletic brilliance, and bounded down the narrow stairs, taking them two at a time in a burst of energy that made the old house creak in familiar protest. The Carter kitchen was a shrine to middle-class American comfort, circa 1966. Yellow Formica countertops, avocado green appliances, and a breakfast nook where the morning light streamed through gingham curtains Helen had sewn herself. Frank sat at the head of the small table, his hardware store uniform pressed and ready, reading the sports section with the concentrated attention of a scholar studying ancient texts. "Cubs lost again," Frank muttered, not looking up from the paper. 3-1. That new kid from Iowa struck out with bases loaded in the ninth. "They'll pull it together," Tommy said with the optimism of youth, sliding into his chair and attacking the plate of scrambled eggs and bacon Helen set before him. "Season's not over." Frank lowered his paper and regarded his son with eyes that had seen too many baseball seasons end in disappointment to share such faith. "Son, hope's a fine thing, but you can't eat it for breakfast." "Frank Carter, don't you go crushing that boy's spirit before he's even finished his eggs," Helen scolded, pouring coffee into Frank's favorite mug, the one advertising Carter's Hardware, we fix what's broken since 1952. She was a small woman with brown hair styled in the kind of careful waves that required weekly appointments at Marge's beauty parlor, but her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent 15 years teaching piano to reluctant children. Tommy grinned and shoveled another forkful of eggs into his mouth. This was their morning ritual, as predictable and comforting as the sunrise, Frank's gentle pessimism balanced by Helen's determined optimism, with Tommy caught somewhere in the middle, trying to figure out which worldview he'd inherit. "Big day today," Helen continued, refilling Tommy's orange juice glass. "Mrs. Patterson at the Five and Dime said Principal Donovan's got some kind of announcement planned. Something about a school competition." Tommy's stomach did a small flip. He'd heard the rumors too, whispers in the hallways, excited conversations between teachers that stopped when students walked by. Whatever Principal Donovan had planned, it was big enough to have the entire school buzzing with anticipation and anxiety. "Probably some fundraising nonsense," Frank said, folding his paper with the crisp efficiency of a man who had places to be. "Schools always need money for something. New uniforms, new books, new gymnasium floor that nobody asked for." "Maybe it's something good," Tommy offered, but his voice carried less conviction than he'd intended. In his experience, school announcements rarely contained the kind of news that made teenage lives easier. Frank stood and kissed Helen's cheek, a gesture so automatic and tender that Tommy sometimes forgot to notice it. "I'll be at the store. Got a delivery of lawnmowers coming in, and harvest season means everyone needs something fixed or replaced." He clapped Tommy on the shoulder. "Work hard, play fair, and remember, a Carter keeps his word." Tommy finished the familiar refrain. "I know, Dad." After Frank left, the kitchen settled into a different rhythm. Helen hummed while she cleared dishes, and Tommy found himself studying the calendar hanging beside the refrigerator. September 1966 was already half gone, marked with Helen's careful notations. Tommy's dentist appointment, church potluck, Mrs. Kowalski's piano lesson. Life in Brooksville moved according to such rhythms, predictable, comfortable, sometimes boring, but undeniably real. "You nervous about something?" Helen asked, settling into the chair Frank had vacated. Tommy looked up from his orange juice, surprised by his mother's perception. "What makes you say that?" "You're drumming your fingers on the table. You always do that when you're thinking too hard about something." She reached over and stilled his hand with her own. "Want to talk about it?" For a moment, Tommy considered telling her everything, about the anxiety that had been building in his chest for weeks, about the feeling that his junior year was supposed to be different somehow, about the way he sometimes felt like he was watching his own life from the outside, waiting for something significant to happen. But how do you explain to your mother that you're tired of being ordinary when ordinary was exactly what she and Frank had worked so hard to provide? "Just school stuff," he said instead. "You know how it is." Helen studied his face with the intensity of someone who had been reading her son's expressions since he was old enough to have them. "I know you're growing up," she said finally, "and that's harder than most people remember it being." Before Tommy could respond, a horn honked outside. 2 short blasts that meant Joey Kowalski was in the driveway, ready for the daily ride to school in his family's hand-me-down Chevy. "That's my cue," Tommy said, grabbing his books and kissing his mother's cheek. "Thanks for breakfast. Have a good day, sweetheart. And remember, whatever happens, you're braver than you think you are." Outside, the September morning had that particular quality of light that photographers spend lifetimes trying to capture. Golden and soft, full of promise and possibility. Joey sat behind the wheel of the blue Chevrolet his older brother had passed down, windows rolled down, radio playing the Beach Boys' Good Vibrations at a volume that would have horrified their parents but felt exactly right for 17-year-old ears. "Morning, sunshine," Joey called, his Polish-American features split by a grin that could charm the chrome off a bumper. "Ready for another thrilling day at Brooksville High, where dreams go to die and textbooks smell like defeat?" Tommy slid into the passenger seat, tossing his books into the back. "You're particularly cheerful this morning." "That's because I have inside information about this big announcement," Joey said, backing out of the driveway with the casual confidence of someone who had been driving farm tractors since he was 12. "My cousin Rita works in the principal's office, and she says it's huge, like change everything about senior year huge. We're juniors, not seniors." Exactly my point. Whatever this is, it's going to affect us too. They drove through the residential streets of Brooksville, past houses where Tommy could recite the histories, the Hendersons in the green 2-story, where Mr. Henderson taught shop class, and Mrs. Henderson made the best apple pie in 3 counties. The Morrison place with its perfect lawn, where Dr. Morrison had delivered half the babies in town. The old Victorian where the Pattersons lived above their 5 and dime store, complete with a ghost story that had been passed down through generations of teenagers. As they turned onto Main Street, Tommy felt the familiar sense of belonging that came with living in a place where every building held memories, where every face was connected to someone you knew, where your grandfather's reputation could still open doors or close them, depending on what kind of man he'd been. "For you ever think about leaving?" Tommy asked suddenly. Joey glanced over, eyebrows raised. "Brooksville all the time, but thinking about something and actually doing it are 2 different things. Besides, where would I go? Chicago? New York? Los Angeles?" He shrugged. "Those places are full of people who grew up in places like Brooksville, trying to get back to something they think they lost. Maybe they found something better. Maybe. Or maybe they found out that geography doesn't change who you are inside." Joey turned into the school parking lot, navigating around buses and other cars with practiced ease. "My dad always says, you can't run away from yourself, but you can sure waste a lot of shoe leather trying." Brooksville High School rose before them, like a monument to American educational aspirations. 3 stories of red brick and limestone, with windows that caught the morning sun and threw it back in golden rectangles. Built in 1923, it had weathered the Depression, the war years, and the social changes of the 1950s, without losing its essential character. Serious, sturdy, and devoted to the proposition that education could transform ordinary Midwestern kids into productive citizens. The parking lot was already filling with the familiar cast of characters that made up Tommy's daily world. There was Brad Wellington, the senior class president, stepping out of his father's Buick like he was campaigning for office even at 8 in the morning. The cheerleaders clustered near the main entrance, their voices carrying across the asphalt in a symphony of enthusiasm that seemed perpetually set to high volume. The farm kids gathered around their pickup trucks, and the town kids gravitated toward their parents' sedans, and everyone pretended not to notice the invisible lines that divided them into tribes. "Tommy! Joey! Over here!" The voice belonged to Susan McKinley, and Tommy felt his heart do that particular skip that had been plaguing him since sophomore year. Susan was Brad Wellington's younger sister by marriage. Her mother had married his father in a union that had surprised everyone by actually working out, and she possessed that rare quality of being genuinely liked by almost everyone without seeming to try. She waved from beside her own group of friends, girls who managed to look both properly wholesome and subtly rebellious, their skirts exactly the right length to satisfy dress code, while somehow suggesting infinite possibilities. Susan's blonde hair fell in the kind of perfect waves that took hours to achieve, but looked effortless, and her smile contained just enough mischief to make Tommy wonder what she thought about when she thought no one was looking. "You think she's waving at you or me?" Joey asked, but his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Probably both of us. We're standing right next to each other." "Keep telling yourself that, Romeo." They walked across the parking lot, books tucked under their arms, joining the stream of students flowing toward the main entrance. The morning ritual of arriving at school was as choreographed as a Broadway musical. Everyone knew their role, their entrance, their relationship to everyone else in the vast teenage ecosystem that was Brooksville High. "Morning, boys," Susan said as they approached, and Tommy caught a hint of vanilla perfume that made him think of birthday cakes and summer afternoons. "Ready for the big announcement?" "Depends what it is," Tommy replied, proud that his voice sounded normal, despite the fact that his pulse had accelerated to approximately hummingbird speed. "I heard it's about some kind of competition between the classes," said Mary Catherine O'Brien, Susan's best friend and the daughter of the town's only lawyer. Mary Catherine had red hair, freckles, and the kind of sharp intelligence that made teachers either love her or fear her, depending on their confidence in their own knowledge. "What kind of competition?" Joey asked. "The kind where there are winners and losers," said a new voice, and Tommy turned to see Bobby Kowalski, Joey's older brother, now a senior, approaching with that swagger that came with being 18, 6 feet tall, and dating the homecoming queen. "Thanks for that insight, Einstein," Joey replied, with the particular brand of affection that brothers reserved for publicly embarrassing each other. Bobby grinned and messed up Joey's carefully combed hair. "Just trying to prepare you younger kids for the harsh realities of competition. We seniors have been dominating this school for 4 years. What makes you think a little contest is going to change that?" "Maybe because you seniors are getting old and soft," Susan suggested sweetly, and Bobby clutched his chest in mock horror. "Susan McKinley, you wound me. Old and soft. I'll have you know I can still bench press my weight and charm my way out of detention. Those are exactly the skills that'll matter in college," Mary Catherine said dryly. The first bell rang then, cutting through their conversation with its familiar urgency. All around them, students began moving toward the entrance with the resigned efficiency of people who had been conditioned by years of bells and schedules and classroom assignments. Inside Brooksville High, the hallways hummed with the energy of 800 teenagers navigating the complex social geography of American adolescence. Lockers slammed, voices echoed off polished floors, and the air carried that particular institutional scent of floor wax, chalk dust, and the kind of industrial-strength cleaning supplies that suggested serious commitment to hygiene. Tommy's locker was on the second floor next to Joey's, and across from the display case where trophies from decades of athletic achievements caught the fluorescent light and threw back memories of past glories. He spun the combination lock 1633-8 and extracted the books he'd need for first-period American history with Mr. Ferguson. "You nervous?" Joey asked, gathering his own materials. "About what?" "The announcement. Whatever it is, it's got everyone talking. Even the teachers seem different today." Tommy considered this. Now that Joey mentioned it, There had been something different about the atmosphere, a tension that felt like the moments before a thunderstorm, when the air itself seems to hold its breath. Maybe a little, he admitted. The second bell rang, and they joined the stream of students heading to first period. American history occupied room 214, overlooking the school's front lawn, where a flagpole stood at attention, and the morning sun illuminated the words, Brooksville High School, Excellence in Education, since 1923, carved into the limestone above the main entrance. Mr. Ferguson was already at his desk when they entered, reviewing notes with the concentration of a general preparing for battle. He was a thin man in his 40s, who wore narrow ties and wire-rimmed glasses, and had the gift of making even the most reluctant students care about things that had happened before they were born. His classroom walls were covered with maps, historical documents, and portraits of presidents who gazed down on students, with expressions ranging from benevolent to stern. "Good morning, class," Mr. Ferguson said as the final bell rang. "Before we continue our discussion of World War II's impact on American society, I should mention that we'll be having an extended homeroom period today for Principal Donovan's announcement, so let's use this time productively." He moved to the blackboard and wrote September 15th, 1966 in his precise handwriting. "Can anyone tell me what significant event occurred on this date in 1935? Several hands went up, but Tommy found himself distracted by the quality of light coming through the tall windows, the way it illuminated dust motes floating in the air like tiny pieces of gold. Outside, he could see the town spreading away from the school in all directions, the residential neighborhoods, where he and his classmates had learned to ride bikes and play capture the flag, the business district where their parents worked and shopped and maintained the rhythms of adult life, the farms beyond where corn grew tall and cattle grazed, and the horizon seemed to promise infinite possibilities. "Mr. Carter," Tommy snapped back to attention, realizing that Mr. Ferguson was looking at him expectantly. "I'm sorry, sir. Could you repeat the question?" Several classmates snickered, but Mr. Ferguson's expression remained patient. "I asked if you could tell us what happened on this date in 1935. Tommy's mind raced through everything he knew about 1935, which was considerably less than he wished it was at this particular moment. The Dust Bowl was happening? That's correct, though it had been ongoing for several years by then. But I was looking for something more specific. Anyone else? Susan raised her hand. The Nuremberg Laws were enacted in Germany. Excellent, Miss McKinley. The Nuremberg Laws, which stripped Jewish citizens of their civil rights and marked a significant escalation in Nazi persecution. Who can tell me why we should care about events that happened in Germany 31 years ago? This time, Tommy's hand went up without hesitation. Because history doesn't happen in isolation. What happened in Germany affected the whole world, including America. Mr. Ferguson nodded approvingly. Precisely. The past is never really past, as William Faulkner wrote. It shapes everything that comes after, often in ways we don't recognize until much later. The discussion continued, ranging from the rise of fascism to America's reluctant entry into World War II, but Tommy found himself thinking about Mr. Ferguson's words. The past is never really past. Was that true of small towns too? Did the things that happened in places like Brooksville echo through time in ways that shaped who people became? At 9:15, the intercom crackled to life with the familiar feedback that made everyone wince. "Attention students and faculty," came the voice of Mrs. Walsh, the principal's secretary. "Please report to the gymnasium for a special assembly. Classes will resume on a modified schedule following the announcement." The classroom erupted in whispers and movement as students gathered their belongings. Tommy felt his stomach clench with anticipation. Whatever was coming, it was big enough to disrupt the entire school day. The gymnasium was a temple to Brooksville's athletic aspirations. High ceilings, polished floors, bleachers that had witnessed decades of basketball games and pep rallies and graduation ceremonies. By the time Tommy and Joey found seats, the space was nearly full, buzzing with the kind of excited energy that comes when routine is disrupted. Principal Margaret Donovan stood at the center of the gym floor, her silver hair perfectly styled, her navy blue suit conveying authority and purpose. She was a formidable woman who had been shaping young minds for 25 years, and students learned early that her approval was worth earning and her disappointment was something to avoid at all costs. "Students of Brooksville High School," she began, her voice carrying easily to the back bleachers without need for a microphone. "As you know, our school has a proud tradition of academic excellence, athletic achievement, and community service. Today, I want to announce an opportunity for you to add another chapter to that tradition." The gymnasium fell silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint sound of traffic from Main Street. "Beginning next Monday, we will launch the first annual Brooksville High School interclass competition," Principal Donovan continued. "This month-long event will pit our senior class against our junior class in a series of challenges designed to test not just your knowledge and skills, but your creativity, leadership, and commitment to our shared values." Tommy felt his pulse quicken. Beside him, Joey leaned forward with interest. "The competition will include academic challenges, creative projects, community service initiatives, and culminating presentations where each class will share their vision for Brooksville's future. The winning class will receive a trophy that will be displayed permanently in our main hallway, individual certificates of achievement, and, most importantly, priority consideration for the 3 academic scholarships our Parent-Teacher Association has established for deserving students." The word scholarships rippled through the gymnasium like electricity. For many students at Brooksville High, college was a dream that required financial assistance to become reality. Each class will need to elect a leadership committee of 5 students who will coordinate their efforts and serve as liaisons with the faculty supervisors. These elections will be held tomorrow, during homeroom period. Tommy's stomach dropped. Leadership positions were typically filled by the same students who ran for student council, played varsity sports, and seemed born to stand in front of crowds. Students like Brad Wellington for the seniors, or Susan McKinley for the juniors. Not students like Tommy Carter, who preferred observing to participating, following to leading. "I want to be clear," Principal Donovan continued, "this competition is about more than winning and losing. It's about discovering what you're capable of when you work together toward a common goal. It's about finding your voice, developing your talents, and contributing something meaningful to your school and community." She paused, scanning the faces in the bleachers with the intensity of someone who had spent decades reading teenage expressions. "Some of you may think you know who your leaders are. Some of you may assume that the same students who always step forward will step forward again. I encourage you to think beyond those assumptions. Sometimes the people who change the world are the ones who never planned to be in charge, but found themselves with something important to say." Tommy felt as though she was speaking directly to him, which was ridiculous. Principal Donovan didn't even know who he was, beyond his name in her files and his parents' reputation in the community. But something in her words made him sit up straighter, made him wonder if maybe she was talking to all the students like him, the ones who lived their lives in the spaces between spotlight moments. The competition officially begins Monday morning with the first challenge. Each class has 1 week to organize and execute a community service project that demonstrates their commitment to making Brooksville a better place. You'll be judged on creativity, impact, organization, and participation. Additional challenges will be announced as the competition progresses. She smiled then, an expression that transformed her from administrator to co-conspirator. "I have great faith in all of you. This school has produced teachers, soldiers, farmers, business owners, artists, and citizens who have made their mark on the world. Now it's your turn to show what you can do." As students filed out of the gymnasium, the air buzzed with excitement and anxiety in equal measure. Tommy found himself swept along in the crowd, his mind racing with possibilities and fears. "This is huge," Joey said as they walked toward their lockers. "Scholarships, recognition, the chance to actually matter for something." "The seniors are going to destroy us," Tommy replied. "They've got Brad Wellington, Lisa Patterson, Bobby Morrison, all the kids who've been running things since they were freshmen. So, we've got talent too. Susan McKinley could organize anything. Mary Catherine O'Brien is smarter than half the teachers, and there are plenty of other kids who just haven't had the chance to show what they can do." Tommy nodded, but his mind was elsewhere, processing something Principal Donovan had said about people who never planned to be in charge, but found themselves with something important to say. Was it possible that he had something important to say? And if he did, would he have the courage to say it? The rest of the morning passed in a blur of classes and conversations, but Tommy found it difficult to concentrate on anything except the competition. By lunchtime, the cafeteria was divided into informal strategy sessions, with seniors clustering around one set of tables and juniors gravitating toward another, voices rising with excitement and speculation. Tommy sat with his usual group, Joey, Susan, Mary Catherine, and a few other students who existed in the comfortable middle ground between popular and invisible. The conversation inevitably turned to leadership elections and strategy. "We need to be smart about this," Susan said, picking at her chicken salad sandwich. "The seniors have experience and confidence, but we have energy and fresh ideas." "We also have you," Mary Catherine added. "Everyone likes you, Susan. If you run for class representative, you'd win easily." Susan smiled, but Tommy noticed it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I appreciate the vote of confidence, but I'm not sure I'm the right person to lead this." "Why not?" Joey asked around a mouthful of meatloaf. "You're smart, popular, organized, and tired of being the person everyone expects to fix everything," Susan interrupted gently. "Sometimes I think it would be nice to support someone else's vision instead of always having to come up with my own." Tommy found himself speaking before he'd fully formed the thought. What if leadership isn't about having all the answers? What if it's about asking the right questions? The table fell quiet, and Tommy realized everyone was looking at him with varying degrees of surprise. He felt heat rise in his cheeks, but pressed on. Principal Donovan said this was about finding our voice and contributing something meaningful. Maybe the best leaders are the ones who help other people find their voices too. Mary Catherine leaned back in her chair, studying Tommy with new interest. "That's actually pretty profound, Carter. Where'd that come from?" "I don't know," Tommy admitted. "Just thinking about what she said about people who never planned to be in charge." Susan reached over and touched his arm briefly, a gesture that sent electricity through his entire nervous system. "You should think about running for something, Tommy. I mean it." "Me?" The word came out higher than he'd intended. "I'm not leadership material." "Says who?" Joey demanded. "You're one of the smartest kids in our class. You actually listen when people talk and you care about doing the right thing. Those seem like pretty good leadership qualities to me." Tommy shook his head, but something stirred in his chest, a mixture of fear and possibility that felt like standing at the edge of a high diving board, knowing you could either make a spectacular splash or a painful belly flop. "Think about it," Susan said. "We need 5 representatives. The election is tomorrow. At least consider putting your name in." The conversation moved on to other topics, but Tommy found himself only half listening. Could he really do it? Could he stand up in front of his classmates and ask them to trust him with something important? The idea terrified him, but it also sparked something he hadn't felt before, the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he had been preparing for this moment his entire life without knowing it. That afternoon, as Joey drove him home through streets that seemed both familiar and somehow different, Tommy stared out the window at the town he'd known all his life and tried to imagine what it would mean to help shape its future. "You're thinking about it, aren't you?" Joey said. "About what?" "Running for class representative. I can see the wheels turning." Tommy sighed. "It's crazy. I've never run for anything in my life. Neither had George Washington before he ran for president." "That's not how the Revolutionary War worked, and you know it," Joey grinned. "Details. The point is, everyone starts somewhere." At home, Tommy found Helen in the living room, grading piano student exercises while the Andy Williams show played softly on the television. She looked up when he entered, and something in his expression must have caught her attention. "How was school, sweetheart?" she asked, setting aside her red pen. Tommy dropped into his father's chair and told her about the competition, the elections, and the conversation at lunch. Helen listened without interruption, her face thoughtful. "So what's stopping you?" she asked when he finished. "Are you kidding? Everything. I'm not popular, I'm not particularly talented at anything, and I've never been in charge of anything bigger than organizing my own sock drawer." Helen smiled. "You know what I see when I look at you, Tommy Carter. I see a young man who notices things other people miss, who thinks before he speaks, and who genuinely cares about other people's feelings. Those might be more valuable leadership qualities than popularity or natural talent. But what if I mess up? What if I let everyone down?" "What if you don't?" Helen countered. "What if you discover that you're capable of more than you ever imagined?" What if the worst thing that could happen is that you learn something about yourself? That evening, as Tommy sat at his desk, supposedly doing homework but actually staring out his bedroom window at the lights of Brooksville, he thought about everything that had happened that day. The competition had changed something in the school's atmosphere, had created possibilities that hadn't existed that morning. Downstairs, he could hear his parents' voices in the kitchen discussing their own days over coffee and Helen's homemade apple pie. The sounds were comforting and familiar, but for the first time, Tommy found himself imagining what it might be like to have different conversations, to be part of something larger than the comfortable routines that had shaped his life. He opened his notebook and wrote at the top of a fresh page, "Reasons to run for class representative." Below that, he drew a line down the middle of the page and labeled the columns "For" and "Against." The "Against" column filled quickly. Inexperience, shyness, fear of public speaking, possibility of failure, comfort with current situation. But as he stared at the "For" column, words began to come slowly. Chance to make a difference, opportunity to grow. Maybe Susan's right about having something to offer could help other quiet kids find their voices. At the bottom of the page, he wrote, "What would I regret more, trying and failing, or never trying at all?" The question hung there on the paper, stark and honest, demanding an answer he wasn't sure he was ready to give. But as he sat in his room, surrounded by the familiar objects of his 16 years, baseball trophies from Little League, books he'd read and reread, photographs of family vacations and school events, Tommy Carter began to understand that sometimes the most important moments in life come disguised as ordinary Tuesday evenings, when everything seems exactly the same as it's always been, except for one crucial difference: you're finally ready to change. Outside his window, Brooksville settled into its nightly rhythm. Porch lights came on, dinner dishes were cleared away, and families gathered around television sets to watch the evening news and learn about a world that seemed both distant and increasingly present in their daily lives. But in one second-story bedroom on Elm Street, a 16-year-old boy was discovering that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with dramatic gestures or sudden revelations, but with the quiet decision to become the person you never knew you had the courage to be. Tomorrow would bring the elections, and with them, the chance for Tommy to step forward or step back, to speak up or stay silent, to discover whether the voice he'd been hearing in his head had anything worth saying to the world outside his window. But tonight, for the first time in his life, Tommy Carter went to sleep believing that maybe, just maybe, he was ready to find out. Tommy woke at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before his alarm was set to ring, with the peculiar clarity that comes from a night spent hovering between sleep and wakefulness. His decision had crystallized sometime during the small hours, emerging from the fog of uncertainty like a lighthouse beam cutting through coastal darkness. He would run for class representative. The realization both terrified and exhilarated him. As he lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of Brooksville awakening, the distant whistle of the 6 a.m. freight train carrying grain to Chicago, Mrs. Henderson's dog barking at the mailman who wouldn't arrive for 3 more hours, Tommy tried to imagine himself standing before his classmates, asking for their trust. Downstairs, Helen was already moving through her morning routine, but something in Tommy's expression when he entered the kitchen made her pause, coffee pot halfway to Frank's mug. "You look different this morning," she observed, studying his face with the intensity of someone who had been reading her son's moods since before he could walk. "I've made a decision about the election," Tommy said, accepting the plate of scrambled eggs she set before him. "I'm going to run." Helen's face broke into a smile that could have powered the entire town. "Tommy Carter, I am so proud of you." Frank looked up from his morning paper. The Cubs had won 7-3, which seemed like a good omen, and regarded his son with the kind of careful attention he usually reserved for complicated repair jobs. "Running for class representative is a big responsibility, son. People will be counting on you to follow through on whatever promises you make." "I know," Tommy said, and was surprised to discover he meant it. "But I think that's exactly why I need to do this. I'm tired of letting other people make all the decisions." "Then you'll need to give them a reason to believe in you," Frank continued. "What are you going to tell them that they can't get from any other candidate?" It was a fair question, and one Tommy had been wrestling with since his moment of clarity in the pre-dawn hours. I'm going to tell them the truth, that I don't have all the answers, but I'm willing to listen and learn and work harder than anyone else to make sure their voices are heard. Helen reached over and squeezed his hand. That's exactly the right answer. The drive to school with Joey felt different that morning. The familiar street seemed charged with possibility, as though the entire town was holding its breath in anticipation of something momentous. Even the weather seemed to be cooperating. One of those perfect September mornings when the air carried just enough coolness to promise autumn's eventual arrival without surrendering summer's lingering warmth. "So," Joey said as they pulled into the school parking lot, "you gonna tell me what's got you looking like you've seen the face of God, or do I have to guess?" "I'm running for class representative." Joey hit the brakes so hard that Tommy had to brace himself against the dashboard. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious." "Tommy Carter, you beautiful crazy son of a gun." Joey's face split into the kind of grin usually reserved for Christmas morning or unexpected snow days. "I knew you had it in you. I've been waiting for you to figure that out for about 3 years now." "You have?" "Of course I have. You think I'm blind?" "You're the guy everyone comes to when they need advice, when they're having problems, when they want someone to actually listen instead of just waiting for their turn to talk. The only person who doesn't see how much people respect you is you." Tommy felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "Thanks, Joey. That means a lot." "Don't thank me yet. Thank me after you win. What makes you so sure I'm going to win?" Joey turned off the engine and looked at his best friend with an expression of absolute certainty. "Because you're the only candidate who's running for the right reasons." Inside the school, Tommy could feel the electricity of Election Day crackling through the hallways. Handmade posters had appeared overnight, taped to lockers and bulletin boards with the enthusiastic amateurishness of teenage political campaigns. "Brad Wellington for senior class rep. Experience matters," proclaimed one. "Lisa Patterson gets things done," announced another. Tommy's stomach clenched as he realized he hadn't made any posters, hadn't prepared any slogans, hadn't done any of the things that seemed essential to running a campaign. But before he could spiral into panic, Susan appeared at his elbow as if summoned by his anxiety. "Morning, Tommy," she said, and he caught that familiar hint of vanilla perfume that never failed to make his brain temporarily forget how to form coherent sentences. "Joey told me about your decision. I think it's wonderful." "You do?" "Of course I do. We need representatives who actually care about representing people, not just padding their college applications." She paused, studying his face. "You look terrified." "I am terrified." "Good. That means you understand how important this is." She smiled, and Tommy felt some of his anxiety ease. "Want some advice from someone who's been in student government since freshman year?" Tommy nodded eagerly. "The best campaigns aren't about telling people what they want to hear. They're about showing people who you really are and letting them decide if that's what they need." Susan touched his arm briefly. "Just be yourself, Tommy. That's already more than most politicians manage." The morning classes passed in a blur of equations and historical dates and literary analysis, but Tommy found it impossible to concentrate on anything except the approaching homeroom period when nominations would be accepted and speeches would be given. His hands felt clammy, his stomach churned with nervous energy, and he found himself rehearsing possible opening lines in his head. "My fellow classmates." No, too formal. "Hi, everyone. Most of you probably don't know me very well." No, too self-deprecating. "I'm running for class representative because why? What was his reason, really, beyond some vague notion that he should step out of his comfort zone? During third period English with Mrs. Morrison, while they discussed the themes of courage and social responsibility in To Kill a Mockingbird, Tommy found himself thinking about Atticus Finch's decision to defend Tom Robinson despite knowing he would face criticism and possible failure. What had given Atticus the courage to do what he believed was right, even when it would have been easier to stay silent? "Mr. Carter," Mrs. Morrison's voice cut through his reverie, "would you care to share your thoughts on Atticus's motivation?" Tommy looked up to find the entire class watching him, including Susan, who sat 2 rows over with an expression of encouraging expectation. He took a breath and spoke from somewhere deeper than his prepared thoughts. "I think Atticus knew that some things are more important than being comfortable," he said. "He could have taken the easy path, But then he would have had to live with knowing he didn't stand up for what was right when it mattered. Sometimes the worst failure isn't losing. It's not trying when you had the chance. Mrs. Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. That's very insightful, Tommy. Can you connect that to the broader themes Harper Lee is exploring? I think she's saying that real courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and doing the right thing anyway, and that everyone has moments when they have to choose between what's easy and what's right. The discussion continued, but Tommy barely heard it. His own words echoed in his mind. Everyone has moments when they have to choose between what's easy and what's right. Was this his moment? Was running for class representative his chance to choose the harder path because it was the right one? When the bell rang for homeroom period, Tommy's legs felt unsteady as he walked to room 108, where Mrs. Patterson, not to be confused with the Mrs. Patterson who ran the five and dime store, served as the junior class advisor. The room was already buzzing with anticipation when he entered, students clustered in small groups discussing strategies and handicapping candidates. "All right, settle down," Mrs. Patterson called, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had been managing teenage chaos for 23 years. She was a sturdy woman with graying hair and kind eyes who taught home economics and somehow made learning about nutrition and budgeting feel like preparation for conquering the world. As you know, today we're electing 5 representatives to serve on the Junior Class Leadership Committee for the inter-class competition. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to address the class, followed by a secret ballot. We'll elect 1 president, 1 vice president, 1 secretary, 1 treasurer, and 1 at-large representative. Tommy felt his pulse accelerate. He had assumed all 5 positions were essentially equal, but the mention of specific roles made everything feel more official, more consequential. "I'll now open the floor for nominations," Mrs. Patterson continued. "Remember, you may nominate yourself or be nominated by a classmate, but all nominees must accept their nomination to be placed on the ballot." Hands shot up around the room. "I nominate Susan McKinley for president," called out David Chen, a quiet kid who rarely spoke in class but apparently felt strongly about leadership. "I accept," Susan said, though Tommy noticed she looked more resigned than excited. "I nominate Mary Catherine O'Brien for secretary," said another voice. "I nominate Jeff Hamilton for treasurer." The nominations continued, with familiar names being called out for various positions. Tommy sat frozen in his seat, waiting for someone else to nominate him, waiting for a sign that he belonged in this conversation. But as the minutes ticked by and more students accepted nominations, he realized that if he was going to do this, he would have to nominate himself. "Are there any other nominations?" Mrs. Patterson asked, scanning the room. Tommy's heart hammered against his ribs. This was it, his moment to step forward or forever wonder what might have been. He raised his hand, and the simple gesture felt like the most courageous thing he had ever done. "Yes, Tommy? I nominate myself for at-large representative." A murmur rippled through the classroom. Tommy could feel eyes turning toward him, some surprised, some curious, some skeptical. In the 3rd row, Susan turned around and gave him a smile of pure encouragement. "I accept," he added, his voice stronger than he'd expected. When the nominations closed, 7 students had put themselves forward for the 5 positions. Susan McKinley, Mary Catherine O'Brien, Jeff Hamilton, Brian Walsh, Amy Stevens, David Chen, and Tommy Carter. Mrs. Patterson wrote their names on the blackboard and explained the speaking order, alphabetical by last name. "Mr. Carter, you're first," she said. Tommy's mouth went dry. He had hoped to go later, to hear what others said and craft his remarks accordingly, but perhaps it was better this way. No time to second-guess himself, no opportunity to lose his nerve. He stood on unsteady legs and made his way to the front of the classroom, acutely aware that 31 pairs of eyes were focused on him. For a moment, he stood there in silence, looking out at faces he had known for years, classmates he had grown up with, shared teachers with, passed in hallways without really seeing. "Hi," he began, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Most of you probably know me as the quiet kid who sits in the back and doesn't say much in class, and that's been fine with me for most of high school. It's safe back there. Nobody expects much from you. Nobody counts on you to have answers. Nobody notices if you don't participate." He paused, gathering his courage for what came next. But yesterday, when Principal Donovan talked about finding our voices and contributing something meaningful, I realized I've been wasting the opportunity to be part of something bigger than myself. I've been so afraid of saying the wrong thing that I've barely said anything at all. Tommy's hands were trembling, but his voice was growing steadier with each word. I'm not running because I think I have all the answers. I'm running because I think I'm good at listening to people who do have answers, and because I care enough about this class and this school to work really hard on whatever we decide to do together. He looked around the room, making eye contact with as many classmates as possible. A lot of you are smarter than me, more talented than me, more confident than me, but I don't think anyone cares more than me about making sure every voice in this room gets heard. If you elect me as your at-large representative, I promise I'll show up to every meeting, I'll listen to every idea, and I'll never vote on anything without first asking what you think we should do. Tommy took a deep breath, feeling like he was about to jump off a cliff. I guess what I'm saying is this. I may not be the obvious choice, but maybe that's exactly what we need. Someone who doesn't assume he knows what's best, someone who remembers what it feels like to sit in the back row, someone who understands that real leadership isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about helping the smartest ideas rise to the surface, no matter where they come from. He paused, and the classroom was completely silent. "Thank you," he said simply, and returned to his seat on legs that somehow carried him despite feeling like they were made of rubber. The other candidates gave their speeches. Susan spoke eloquently about uniting the class behind common goals. Mary Catherine outlined specific organizational strategies. Jeff presented a detailed budget proposal for fundraising activities. They were all polished, confident, clearly prepared. Tommy began to wonder if his moment of honesty had been a mistake, if his classmates wanted competence more than authenticity. But when the speeches ended and Mrs. Patterson distributed the ballots, Tommy noticed something that surprised him. Several classmates nodded at him or gave him encouraging looks. Sarah Walsh, a girl who had never spoken to him outside of group projects, mouthed "good job" as she passed his desk. Even Brad Wellington's younger brother Mike, who had transferred into their class and carried some of his family's natural confidence, gave him a thumbs up. The voting process felt eternal. Students marked their ballots in secret, folded them carefully, and dropped them into the cardboard box Mrs. Patterson had decorated with red, white, and blue construction paper. When everyone had voted, she enlisted David Chen and Amy Stevens to help count the ballots, while the rest of the class pretended to work on other assignments. Tommy stared at his American history textbook without seeing the words on the page. His mind raced through every possible outcome: crushing defeat, narrow loss, unlikely victory, landslide triumph. Each scenario felt equally terrifying in its own way. "All right, class," Mrs. Patterson said finally, "we have our results." The room fell silent again, 31 teenagers holding their breath. "Your junior class president with 18 votes is Susan McKinley." Applause erupted, and Susan blushed, but smiled graciously. Tommy felt a mixture of happiness for her and renewed nervousness about his own fate. "Your vice president with 15 votes is Mary Catherine O'Brien. Your secretary with 22 votes is Amy Stevens. Your treasurer with 19 votes is Jeff Hamilton." Tommy's heart sank. 4 positions filled, and he hadn't been called. That meant either Brian Walsh or David Chen had won the at-large position, and he would return to his comfortable spot in the back row, probably for the rest of high school. "And your at-large representative," Mrs. Patterson continued, and Tommy could swear she was looking directly at him, "with 16 votes, is Tommy Carter." The world stopped. Tommy was certain he had misheard, certain this was some kind of mistake or dream or elaborate practical joke. But then the applause started. Not polite, obligatory clapping, but genuine, enthusiastic approval from classmates who had apparently seen something in him that he was only beginning to recognize in himself. Susan turned around in her seat and beamed at him. "Congratulations, Representative Carter," she said, and Tommy felt like he might float right out of his chair. Joey, who had somehow managed to position himself near the door so he could hear the results from the hallway, stuck his head into the classroom long enough to give Tommy a victorious grin and a thumbs up before disappearing to spread the news. The rest of the day passed in a haze of congratulations and backslaps and questions about what the leadership committee would do first. Tommy found himself in the surreal position of being someone people sought out for conversation, someone whose opinions suddenly mattered in ways they never had before. At lunch, the 5 newly elected representatives gathered at a table that felt somehow more significant than the same table where Tommy had eaten lunch for 3 years. Susan took charge naturally, but in a way that made everyone feel included rather than managed. "So," she said, unwrapping a sandwich that looked like it had been assembled by someone who actually knew how to make food look appetizing, "what do we think about this community service challenge? We need something that shows we're serious but also showcases what makes our class special," Mary Catherine said, consulting notes she had apparently already started taking. "The seniors are probably going to do something traditional. Food drive, clothing collection, something safe. Which means we need to think bigger," added Jeff, who had brought a lunch that consisted entirely of items from the vending machine, but somehow managed to make it look like a conscious dietary choice rather than poor planning. Amy Stevens, who Tommy was learning had strong opinions despite her quiet demeanor, leaned forward. "What if we focused on something that connects to the competition itself? Something that shows we understand what Principal Donovan meant about contributing to the community?" Tommy found himself speaking before he could stop himself. "What about the elementary school?" Everyone turned to look at him, and he felt the familiar heat of self-consciousness rise in his cheeks. But something about being elected had loosened whatever had been holding his thoughts back. "I mean, think about it," he continued. "We're supposed to show our vision for Brooksville's future, right? Well, the kids at Lincoln Elementary are literally Brooksville's future. What if our community service project involved working with them somehow?" Susan's eyes lit up. "That's brilliant. What did you have in mind?" Tommy's mind raced, ideas tumbling over each other in their hurry to be expressed. "Reading programs, maybe? Or tutoring? My mum teaches piano, and she's always talking about how the elementary school needs more arts programs. What if we organized some kind of, I don't know, talent show or arts festival for them? A junior high students teaching elementary students festival," Mary Catherine said slowly, her journalist's instincts clearly engaged. "That could work. It shows leadership, community investment, creativity. And it's something the seniors would never think of," Amy added with a grin. "They're all about doing things for people their own age or older. This shows we understand that leadership means investing in the next generation." Jeff was already scribbling numbers on a napkin. "Budget-wise, it could work. We'd need supplies for art projects, maybe some basic musical instruments, but nothing too expensive. And if we get local businesses to donate materials..." "My dad knows everyone in town," Susan said. "He could help us line up sponsors." Tommy listened to the conversation spiraling into logistics and felt something he had never experienced before. The intoxicating sensation of seeing an idea take shape, of watching other people get excited about something that had started as a stray thought in his head. "There's something else," he said when the initial wave of enthusiasm had crested. "If we're really serious about this, we should make it bigger than just our class project. What if we made it an annual thing? The Brooksville High Arts Festival for elementary students, something that outlasts this competition and becomes part of what makes our school special." The table fell quiet, and Tommy worried he had overreached, suggested something too ambitious for a group of 16 and 17-year-olds to accomplish. But then Susan reached over and touched his arm, the same brief contact that never failed to short-circuit his nervous system. "Tommy Carter," she said, "that might be the best idea anyone's had about anything in the history of ideas." The rest of lunch was spent sketching out preliminary plans. They would propose the arts festival to the full junior class tomorrow, get feedback and volunteers, then approach Principal Donovan and the elementary school principal about logistics. If everything went well, they could have the festival organized within 2 weeks, well ahead of the competition deadline. As they gathered their things to head to 5th period classes, Mary Catherine pulled Tommy aside. "Can I ask you something?" she said, her reporter's instincts clearly engaged. "Sure. Yesterday you were the kid who never raised his hand in class. Today you're coming up with ideas that could change the whole school. What happened?" Tommy considered the question seriously. "I guess I got tired of waiting for permission to care about things." Mary Catherine studied his face for a moment, then nodded. "That's going to be the headline of my article about this in the school newspaper. Getting tired of waiting for permission to care. You're writing an article about the competition?" "I'm writing an article about you," she said matter-of-factly. "The quiet kid who became a leader overnight. It's a good story, Tommy. People need to hear it." The afternoon classes felt different somehow, as though Tommy was experiencing them from a new perspective. In chemistry, when Mr. Rodriguez asked for volunteers to demonstrate a reaction, Tommy found himself raising his hand. In physical education, when teams were being chosen for volleyball, he stepped forward to be a team captain instead of waiting to be picked. Small gestures, but they felt revolutionary. After school, as he waited for Joey in the parking lot, Tommy was approached by students he barely knew. Underclassmen who had heard about the arts festival idea, classmates who wanted to volunteer, even a few seniors who grudgingly admitted that the junior class might have come up with something worth paying attention to. Carter. The voice belonged to Brian Walsh, the candidate who had lost the at-large representative election to Tommy by a margin that was probably closer than either of them wanted to think about. Tommy tensed, expecting resentment or challenge, but Brian's expression was surprisingly friendly. "Congratulations on the win," Brian said, extending his hand. "And I mean that. I voted for myself, obviously, but if I had to lose to someone, I'm glad it was you." Tommy shook his hand, confused. "Why?" "Because you're the only candidate who talked about listening instead of talking. This school's got plenty of people who know how to make speeches. It needs more people who know how to hear what others are saying." As Brian walked away, Tommy felt a strange mixture of humility and pride. He was beginning to understand that leadership wasn't about having all the answers or being the most charismatic person in the room. It was about creating space for other people to contribute their best ideas and work together towards something larger than any individual could accomplish alone. Joey finally appeared, jogging across the parking lot with the kind of boundless energy that seemed to power him through life. "Sorry I'm late," he called. "Had to stay after and talk to Coach Martinez about baseball tryouts next spring. But I heard all about lunch and the arts festival and how you're basically running the junior class now." "I'm not running anything," Tommy protested as they climbed into the Chevy. "It's a team effort." "Right. And I suppose it was just a coincidence that every good idea came from you." Tommy didn't have an answer for that, partly because he wasn't sure it was true, and partly because he was still processing the fact that ideas had been coming from him at all. For 16 years, he had been a consumer of other people's thoughts and plans and initiatives. Today, for the first time, he had been a creator. The drive home took them through the heart of Brooksville, past the businesses and houses and landmarks that had formed the backdrop of Tommy's entire life. But everything looked slightly different now, as though he was seeing it through new eyes. The hardware store where his father worked wasn't just a place that sold tools and supplies. It was a cornerstone of the community, a place where people gathered to solve problems and share information. The elementary school wasn't just a building where children learned to read and write. It was where the next generation of Brooksville citizens were being shaped. "You know what's funny?" Joey said as they turned onto Elm Street. "I always knew you had it in you to be a leader. I just never thought you'd figure it out during high school. What made you so sure?" "You remember when we were kids and we used to play Army in the woods behind the Hendersons' house?" Tommy nodded. They had spent countless summer afternoons fighting imaginary battles among the oak trees, using sticks as weapons and their considerable imaginations to create elaborate scenarios. "You were never the guy who wanted to be the general," Joey continued. "But you were always the guy who figured out the best strategies, who made sure everyone got to play important roles, who remembered the rules and kept the game fair. That's leadership, Tommy. Real leadership." At home, Tommy found his parents in the kitchen, lingering over coffee and the day's mail in the way that suggested they had been waiting for him. "Well," Helen said before he had even set down his books. "How did the election go?" "I won," Tommy said, and realized he was grinning. Helen let out a whoop of celebration that would have been audible 3 houses away. Frank stood and clapped Tommy on the shoulder with the kind of firm approval that meant more to Tommy than any trophy or certificate ever could. "Tell us everything," Helen demanded, pouring him a glass of milk and pushing a plate of chocolate chip cookies toward him with the urgency of someone who understood that momentous occasions required proper nourishment. Tommy found himself talking for nearly an hour, describing the speeches and the vote counting and the lunch meeting and the arts festival plan. His parents listened with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for really good television shows or important news broadcasts. An arts festival for elementary students, Frank mused when Tommy had finished. That's smart thinking, son. Shows you understand that building community means investing in its future. And it plays to your strengths, Helen added. You've always been good with younger kids. Remember how you used to help me with the beginners' piano lessons? Tommy had forgotten about that, but now the memory came flooding back. Saturday mornings when Helen was overbooked, and he would work with 6- and 7-year-olds on basic scales and simple songs. He had enjoyed it more than he'd realized at the time, had taken pride in their small accomplishments and improvements. We'll need to talk to Mrs. Davidson at Lincoln Elementary, Tommy said, his mind already working through logistics. And we'll need to get permission from Principal Donovan and organize volunteers and figure out what kinds of activities to include. Slow down there, Representative Carter, Frank said with a chuckle. Rome wasn't built in a day. But it was built, Tommy replied, surprising himself with the confidence in his voice. One stone at a time. That evening, Tommy sat at his desk with a notebook and a pencil, sketching out ideas for the arts festival, reading stations where high school students could work with elementary kids on phonics and vocabulary, art tables for painting and drawing projects, a music corner where students could try different instruments, maybe even a small performance area where the elementary students could show off what they'd learned. As he worked, Tommy found himself thinking about Principal Donovan's words about finding your voice and contributing something meaningful. For 16 years, he had been waiting for someone to give him permission to matter, waiting for an invitation to step out of the background and into the light. But maybe that wasn't how it worked. Maybe you had to give yourself permission, had to decide that your ideas and efforts and caring were valuable, even if nobody else had noticed them yet. Outside his window, Brooksville was settling into its evening rhythm. Dinners being served, homework being assigned, families gathering around television sets to watch the evening news. But in his room, Tommy Carter was discovering something that would change not just his own life, but the lives of everyone whose path would cross his in the weeks and years to come. He was discovering that the most powerful voice in the world might be the one that had been waiting inside him all along, just looking for the courage to speak up. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, presenting the arts festival idea to the junior class, navigating the complex politics of high school social dynamics, proving that his election hadn't been a fluke. But tonight, for the first time in his life, Tommy Carter went to sleep not as someone who wondered what he might be capable of, but as someone who was eager to find out. The boy who had spent 16 years in the back row was finally ready to step forward, and Brooksville, whether it knew it or not, was about to discover what happened when quiet kids found their voices and decided to use them to change the world. 3 weeks later, Tommy Carter stood in the gymnasium of Lincoln Elementary School, watching 7-year-old Emma Rodriguez carefully paint a watercolor sunset, while 16-year-old Sarah Walsh offered gentle guidance about mixing colors. The first annual Brooksville High Arts Festival for elementary students was in full swing, and the transformation was nothing short of magical. What had begun as a desperate brainstorm during lunch had evolved into something that exceeded even Tommy's most optimistic expectations. The elementary school gymnasium had been converted into a wonderland of creative stations. Reading corners where high schoolers helped younger children sound out words in picture books, music areas where teenagers demonstrated everything from guitar to harmonica, art tables splashed with the joyful chaos of young imagination, and even a small stage where impromptu performances erupted with the spontaneity that only children possessed. Tommy! The voice belonged to Mrs. Davidson, the elementary school principal, a woman whose enthusiasm for education was matched only by her ability to maintain order among 300 children under the age of 12. I just got off the phone with Superintendent Miller. He wants to make this an official district program, funded through the school board. Your little arts festival is about to become a permanent part of the Brooksville educational experience. Tommy felt that familiar mixture of pride and disbelief that had been following him around for 3 weeks. Really? Really? And I'll tell you something else. I've been an educator for 28 years, and I've rarely seen high school students work with such genuine enthusiasm and care. Whatever you're doing differently over at Brooksville High, it's working. As Mrs. Davidson moved on to coordinate the next wave of activities, Tommy surveyed the scene with something approaching wonder. Susan was at the reading station, her blonde hair falling forward as she helped a shy second grader navigate the adventures of green eggs and ham. Mary Catherine had transformed into an art instructor, demonstrating paper sculpture techniques with the patience of someone twice her age. Jeff Hamilton, who Tommy had never seen display interest in anything beyond mathematics and baseball statistics, was teaching a group of kindergartners how to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star on small wooden xylophones donated by Patterson's Five and Dime. Even Joey had found his element, leading an enthusiastic group of third graders in what appeared to be an improvised theater exercise involving pirates, treasure, and enough dramatic gesturing to power a small city. "You did this," said a voice beside him, and Tommy turned to find Amy Stevens holding a paint-splattered apron and wearing the kind of satisfied exhaustion that comes from meaningful work. "We did this," Tommy corrected. "All of us." Amy shook her head. "No, Tommy. We helped, but this was your vision. And look at it." She gestured toward the controlled chaos surrounding them. "Look what happens when someone cares enough to turn an idea into reality." Before Tommy could respond, Principal Donovan approached, accompanied by a man Tommy didn't recognize. Older, wearing a suit that suggested authority, carrying himself with the kind of confident purpose that marked him as someone accustomed to making important decisions. "Tommy," Principal Donovan said, "I'd like you to meet Superintendent Miller." Tommy wiped his paint-stained hands on his jeans and extended one toward the superintendent, hoping his nervousness wasn't too obvious. "It's an honor to meet you, sir." "The honor is mine, young man," Superintendent Miller replied, his handshake firm and his expression genuinely impressed. "I've heard remarkable things about your leadership throughout this competition, but seeing this festival in action, it's extraordinary. You've created something that serves not just your own class's competitive interests, but the entire educational community." "Thank you, sir, but I really can't take all the credit." "Tommy," the superintendent interrupted gently, "one of the hallmarks of true leadership is the instinct to share credit with others. But don't diminish your own contribution. This festival represents exactly the kind of innovative, community-focused thinking we need more of in education." He paused, observing a nearby station where high school students were helping elementary children create simple musical instruments from everyday materials. "I understand the interclass competition has one more challenge remaining: individual presentations about your vision for Brooksville's future. Is that correct?" Tommy nodded, his stomach tightening slightly at the reminder. The final challenge, scheduled for the following Friday, would require each class's leadership committee to present their comprehensive vision for the community's future to a panel of judges, including school board members, city council representatives, and local business leaders. It was the competition's culminating event, and the component that would ultimately determine the winner. "Well," Superintendent Miller continued, "based on what I've seen here today, I'd say your vision is already becoming reality. Good luck with your presentation." As the superintendent moved on to observe other stations, Tommy felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Frank Carter, still wearing his hardware store uniform, looking around the gymnasium with an expression of quiet amazement. "Dad, what are you doing here?" "Your mother insisted we come see what you'd been working on," Frank said. "She said it was important." He paused, watching a group of high schoolers help elementary students construct simple birdhouses from wooden scraps he had donated from the store. "She was right. This is something special, son." Helen appeared at Frank's elbow, her eyes bright with the kind of maternal pride that could power small appliances. "Tommy Carter, I have never been so proud of anything in my entire life. And that includes the time you hit that home run in Little League." "It's just a school project, Mom." "No," Helen said firmly, "it's not. This is what happens when good people decide to make the world a little bit better. This is what community looks like." As his parents wandered off to explore the various stations, Tommy found himself standing alone for the first time all day, surrounded by the beautiful chaos he had helped create. Children's laughter mixed with teenage voices offering encouragement, paintbrushes scratched against paper, wooden mallets struck xylophones in approximations of melody, and somewhere in the corner, a small boy was explaining to Mary Catherine why his drawing of his dog had 6 legs instead of 4. "Because he runs really fast and fast dogs need extra legs." "Pretty amazing, huh?" Tommy turned to find Susan beside him, holding a construction paper flower that had obviously been made by very small, very enthusiastic hands. "A gift from my reading partner," she explained, twirling the flower between her fingers. "She said it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever made and she wanted me to have it." "That's sweet." "It is. But you know what's even sweeter? Watching her read an entire book by herself for the first time. She was so proud, Tommy. And she should be. It was hard work and she didn't give up." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the organized chaos swirl around them. Tommy was acutely aware of Susan's presence beside him, the familiar scent of her vanilla perfume mingling with the smell of tempera paint and childhood excitement. "Can I tell you something?" Susan said after a while. Tommy nodded, not trusting his voice. "When I first heard about this competition, I was dreading it. Another chance for the same people to do the same kinds of things, you know. Another opportunity for kids like me to end up organizing bake sales and car washes and calling it leadership." She turned to face him, and Tommy felt that familiar skip in his heartbeat. "But you changed all that. You made it mean something. You turned a silly school competition into this." She gestured toward the festival around them. "You made it about something bigger than winning or losing." "Susan, I'm not finished," she said, smiling to soften the interruption. "I've been thinking about what real leadership looks like, and I think I got it wrong for a long time. I thought it was about being the person with all the answers, the one who could organize everything and fix everyone's problems." She paused, watching a group of fifth graders perform an impromptu puppet show with socks and markers. "But watching you these past 3 weeks, I've realized that the best leaders aren't the ones who have all the answers. They're the ones who ask the right questions, who create space for other people's ideas to grow, who care more about the outcome than about getting credit." Tommy felt heat rise in his cheeks, partly from embarrassment and partly from something deeper, the recognition that Susan saw him clearly, saw not just who he was, but who he was becoming. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For believing I could do this before I believed it myself." Susan stepped closer, and for a moment, Tommy thought she might kiss him. Instead, she reached over and tucked the construction paper flower into his shirt pocket, her fingers lingering briefly against his chest. "Keep this," she said, "to remember that the most beautiful things are usually the ones made with love by people who aren't worried about perfection." The festival continued for another hour, ending with the impromptu concert where all the elementary students performed songs they had learned or created during the day. Tommy stood at the back of the gymnasium with his fellow representatives and their families, listening to 200 young voices raised in joyful, imperfect harmony, and understood that he was witnessing something he would remember for the rest of his life. As families began collecting children and cleaning up supplies, Tommy found himself in conversation with Mrs. Davidson again. "I want to thank you for this," she said, her voice carrying the satisfied exhaustion of someone who had just participated in something meaningful. "Not just for today, but for showing our students what high schoolers can be at their best. You've given them something to aspire to." "We learned as much from them as they learned from us," Tommy replied, and meant it. "That's exactly what I mean. You understand that teaching and learning go both ways, that community is built through mutual investment and care." She paused, studying his face with the intensity of someone who had spent decades evaluating young people's character. "What are you planning to do after high school, Tommy?" The question caught him off guard. A month ago, his post-graduation plans had consisted of vague notions about college, maybe studying business or engineering, following a path that seemed safe and practical. But now, "I'm not sure," he said honestly, "but I think it might involve education somehow, or community work, something that brings people together." Mrs. Davidson smiled. "When you figure it out, come talk to me. So I think you might be surprised by the opportunities that exist for young people who understand what you're beginning to understand." The drive home that evening was quiet, each member of the Carter family lost in their own thoughts about what they had witnessed. The sun was setting over Brooksville's familiar landscape, painting the cornfields and distant farmhouses in shades of gold and amber that would stay fixed in Tommy's memory like a photograph. "You know," Frank said as they turned onto Elm Street, "I've lived in this town for 43 years, and I've seen a lot of good ideas come and go. But what you kids did today, that's the kind of thing that changes a place permanently, makes it better for everyone who comes after." "Your father's right," Helen added from the passenger seat. "What you created today wasn't just a school project or a competition entry. It was a gift to the community, something that will keep giving long after you've graduated and moved on to whatever comes next." At home, Tommy retreated to his room with homework he had no intention of completing. Instead, he sat at his desk and tried to organize his thoughts for the final competition presentation that would take place in 5 days. Each leadership team was required to present a comprehensive vision for Brooksville's future. Not just immediate improvements, but long-term strategies for growth, development, and community building. The senior class, he had heard through the school's efficient gossip network, was preparing a presentation focused on economic development, attracting new businesses, improving infrastructure, modernizing the downtown area. It was a solid, practical approach that would undoubtedly impress the adult judges. But Tommy found himself thinking about something different, something that had crystallized during the arts festival as he watched teenagers and children work together with such natural enthusiasm and care. He pulled out a fresh notebook and wrote at the top of the page, "Brooksville 1976, a vision for community." Below that, he began sketching out ideas that felt both ambitious and achievable. Expanded arts programs connecting all grade levels, with high school students serving as mentors and teaching assistants. Annual festivals celebrating different aspects of community life, arts, agriculture, local history, innovation. Partnerships between the school district and local businesses that create learning opportunities for students while addressing real community needs. Youth leadership programs that give teenagers meaningful roles in local government and civic organizations. As he wrote, Tommy realized he was describing not just improvements to existing systems, but a fundamental reimagining of what small-town community could look like, a place where every generation had something to contribute and everyone's talents were recognized and utilized. The telephone rang downstairs, and a few minutes later, Helen called up that Susan McKinley was on the line for him. Tommy's heart did its familiar skip as he picked up the extension in his parents' bedroom. "Hi, Susan." "Hi, Tommy. I hope I'm not bothering you. I know you're probably working on the presentation. Actually, I was hoping we could talk about that. I've been thinking about our approach and I wanted to run some ideas by the team before I get too far down any particular path." "That's exactly why I called. Mary Catherine and I were talking after the festival today, and we both feel like we should build our presentation around what happened today. Not just describe it, but use it as a model for what Brooksville could become." Tommy felt a rush of excitement and relief. That's exactly what I was thinking. Her community where every generation supports and learns from every other generation, where the schools are connected to local businesses and organizations, where young people have real opportunities to contribute, a place where leadership development starts early and continues throughout people's lives, Susan continued, her voice carrying the enthusiasm that always made Tommy's pulse accelerate. They talked for nearly an hour, their individual ideas weaving together into something larger and more comprehensive than either could have developed alone. By the time they hung up, Tommy had filled 6 pages with notes and felt confident that their presentation would offer something genuinely unique and meaningful. The following Monday brought news that the Arts Festival had exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. The local newspaper, the Brooksville Herald, ran a front-page article with photographs of high schoolers working with elementary students, accompanied by an editorial calling for the festival to become an annual tradition. The Regional Education Association had contacted Superintendent Miller about featuring Brooksville's intergenerational arts program at their spring conference. 3 other school districts had already inquired about implementing similar programs. But more importantly to Tommy, he noticed changes in the daily rhythms of school life. Students who had participated in the festival continued to greet each other in the hallways with the easy familiarity of people who had shared meaningful work. Several high schoolers had volunteered to serve as regular tutors at the elementary school. The artificial boundaries between different social groups seemed less rigid, as though the experience of working together toward a common goal had reminded everyone that they were part of the same community. Wednesday afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to Tommy's American history class. Principal Donovan appeared at the door during Mr. Ferguson's lecture about the Marshall Plan, whispered something to the teacher, and then approached Tommy's desk. "Mr. Carter, Could I see you in my office for a few minutes? Tommy's stomach clenched. Being called to the principal's office, even when you hadn't done anything wrong, still carried the weight of childhood anxiety. He gathered his books and followed Principal Donovan through hallways that suddenly seemed longer than usual. Her office was exactly what Tommy had expected: neat, professional, lined with photographs of graduating classes and commendation letters from various educational organizations. Principal Donovan gestured for him to sit in one of the chairs facing her desk, then settled into her own chair with the kind of purposeful attention that suggested this was a conversation she had been planning. "Tommy, I want to talk to you about your presentation on Friday. Is there a problem?" "Quite the opposite. I've been hearing remarkable things from other faculty members, from parents, from community members who participated in or witnessed the Arts Festival. What you and your team accomplished has generated the kind of positive attention that school administrators dream about." Tommy felt both pride and nervousness in equal measure. "Thank you, but I want to make sure you know that it was really a team effort." Principal Donovan held up a hand. "Tommy, you've been deflecting credit for 3 weeks now. While humility is admirable, there comes a point where false modesty becomes a disservice to your own accomplishments." She leaned forward, her expression becoming more serious. "I'm going to share something with you that I probably shouldn't. The school board has been discussing the competition, and they're particularly interested in Friday's presentations, not just as the culmination of a school contest, but as a genuine opportunity to hear fresh ideas about community development from young people who will inherit whatever decisions we make today." Tommy's pulse quickened. "What does that mean?" "It means that your presentation isn't just being judged as a school project, it's being evaluated as a potential blueprint for real community initiatives. If your ideas are compelling enough, you might find yourself with opportunities to help implement them." The weight of that possibility settled on Tommy's shoulders like a heavy coat. "That's intimidating." "It should be. But it's also exactly the kind of opportunity that comes along rarely in life. The chance to have your voice heard by people who can actually act on your ideas." Principal Donovan smiled. "I have great confidence in you, Tommy. You've already proven that you can turn vision into reality. Now you have the chance to do it on a larger scale." As Tommy returned to class, his mind raced with the implications of what Principal Donovan had shared. The presentation he had been thinking of as the final challenge of a school competition had suddenly become something much more significant, a genuine opportunity to influence his community's future. That evening, Tommy called an emergency meeting of the junior class leadership team. They gathered in the McKinley family's living room, surrounded by poster boards and markers and the comfortable chaos of collaborative planning. Susan's stepfather had graciously retreated to his study, but not before providing sodas and what he called thinking food: pretzels, apple slices, and chocolate chip cookies that Susan's mother had apparently baked with the specific intention of fueling teenage creativity. "So," Tommy began, "I found out today that our presentation might be more important than we thought." He explained his conversation with Principal Donovan, watching as his teammates' expressions shifted from excitement to nervousness to determination. "This changes everything," Mary Catherine said, her journalist instincts immediately engaged. "We're not just competing against the seniors anymore. We're presenting to people who could actually implement our ideas." "Which means we need to make sure our ideas are implementable," Jeff added, his practical nature asserting itself. "No more blue sky dreaming. Everything we propose needs to be realistic, budgeted, and achievable." Amy leaned back in her chair, considering. "Actually, I think we need to balance both. Yes, our ideas need to be practical, but they also need to be inspiring. The adults in that room have heard plenty of practical presentations. What they haven't heard is a vision that makes them excited about Brooksville's possibilities." Susan nodded. "Amy's right. We need to show them not just what we think should happen, but why it matters. What it could mean for families and businesses and young people who might otherwise leave town after graduation." They spent the next 3 hours refining their presentation, weaving together research Mary Catherine had gathered about successful small-town development programs, budget projections Jeff had calculated for various initiatives, and the philosophical framework Tommy had developed around intergenerational community building. The resulting presentation was ambitious but achievable, creative but grounded in reality. They proposed expanding the Arts Festival into a year-round program that would include monthly workshops, seasonal performances, and summer camps for children whose parents worked during school breaks. They outlined a youth mentorship program that would pair high school students with middle schoolers with elementary students, creating chains of support and leadership development that would persist through each student's entire educational experience. Most importantly, they articulated a vision of Brooksville as a community that invested in all its residents, not just the adults who made immediate economic contributions, but the children who represented future possibilities and the teenagers who were often overlooked despite their energy, creativity, and idealism. "What do you think?" Tommy asked as they reviewed their final outline. "I think," Susan said slowly, "that we've created something worth fighting for." Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October clarity that made everything seem possible. Tommy woke early and spent extra time getting ready, knowing that this presentation might be the most important thing he had ever done. He chose his best shirt, the blue Oxford Helen had bought him for the start of the school year, and the tie Frank had worn to his own high school graduation 30 years earlier. At breakfast, his parents were subdued but encouraging, recognizing that their son was facing something significant. "Remember," Frank said as Tommy gathered his presentation materials, "you've already proven you can turn ideas into reality. Today is just about helping other people see what you've already shown us. And remember," Helen added, pressing a paper bag into his hands, "that I made your favorite cookies for after the presentation. Win or lose, you'll have something sweet to look forward to." The school day passed in a blur of classes, where Tommy found it impossible to concentrate on anything except the presentation scheduled for that afternoon. By lunchtime, nervous energy was radiating from both the junior and senior leadership teams, creating an atmosphere of anticipation that seemed to affect the entire school. At 2:30, both teams gathered in the main hallway outside the library, where the presentations would take place. The senior team looked polished and confident, dressed in matching blazers and carrying professional-looking presentation binders. Brad Wellington, as senior class president, was clearly in his element, joking casually with his teammates and projecting the kind of effortless leadership that had made him successful throughout high school. "Good luck today, Carter," he said as they waited for the doors to open. "May the best team win." "Thanks, Brad. Same to you. I hear you guys have put together something pretty impressive. The Arts Festival got a lot of people talking." Tommy was surprised by the genuine respect in Brad's voice. "We tried to focus on ideas that could really make a difference." "That's smart. The judges want to see substance, not just presentation skills." Brad paused, studying Tommy's face. "You know, I've been watching what you've done this semester, how you've stepped up and taken leadership. It's been impressive to watch." Before Tommy could respond, the library doors opened, and Mrs. Walsh, the principal's secretary, invited both teams inside. The library had been transformed into a formal presentation space. Tables arranged in a U-shape seated the judges, school board members, city council representatives, local business owners, and education officials Tommy recognized from newspaper photographs. At the front of the room stood a podium, a projection screen, and two tables where the competing teams would sit while waiting their turns. Superintendent Miller served as the moderator, explaining the format and expectations. Each team would have 20 minutes to present their vision, followed by 10 minutes of questions from the judges. The senior class would present first, followed by the juniors. Tommy watched nervously as the senior team took their positions. Brad Wellington approached the podium with the confidence of someone who had been preparing for moments like this his entire life. "Members of the school board, city council, and community leaders," Brad began, "thank you for this opportunity to share our vision for Brooksville's future. As the graduating class of 1967, we understand that we're inheriting responsibility for this community's continued growth and prosperity." The senior presentation was polished, comprehensive, and impressively researched. They proposed attracting light manufacturing businesses to provide employment for high school graduates who didn't attend college, developing the downtown area with new retail and restaurant options, improving infrastructure to support population growth, and establishing a community college satellite program to provide continuing education opportunities. It was a solid, practical vision that addressed real economic needs and challenges. The judges nodded approvingly, asked thoughtful questions, and clearly found the proposals worthy of serious consideration. As the senior team concluded their presentation to respectful applause, Tommy felt his stomach tighten with anxiety. How could his team's more idealistic, less conventionally focused presentation compete with such professional competence? But then Susan caught his eye and smiled, and Tommy remembered what they had discovered over the past month, that the most powerful ideas weren't always the most obvious ones, and that sometimes the best solutions came from people who approached problems from unexpected angles. "Thank you, senior class, for an excellent presentation," Superintendent Miller said. "We'll now hear from the junior class leadership team." Tommy and his teammates approached the front of the room, and suddenly the faces of the judges seemed less intimidating and more curious. These were people who cared about Brooksville, who wanted to see it thrive, who were genuinely interested in hearing fresh perspectives. Susan stepped to the podium first, her presence immediately commanding the room's attention. "3 weeks ago," she began, "most of us thought this competition was about winning a trophy and some scholarship money. But something happened that changed our understanding of what we were really competing for." She paused, making eye contact with several judges. "We discovered that the most meaningful victories aren't about defeating other people. They're about creating something valuable that didn't exist before." Susan gestured toward Tommy, and he stood to join her at the podium, his heart pounding but his mind clear. "When we started planning our community service project," Tommy said, "we asked ourselves a simple question. What does Brooksville need that nobody's thinking about? The answer we found was connection, opportunities for different generations to learn from each other, to work together, to build relationships that make our community stronger." He described the Arts Festival not as a completed project, but as a pilot program that had revealed possibilities they were only beginning to explore. Mary Catherine joined them to present research about communities that had successfully implemented intergenerational programming, demonstrating measurable improvements in everything from academic achievement to senior citizen wellness. Jeff outlined the economic implications, showing how arts and mentorship programs could reduce the need for expensive remedial education services while creating new opportunities for local artists, craftspeople, and educators to contribute their skills. Amy concluded their formal presentation by addressing what she called the retention challenge, the tendency for young people to leave small towns after graduation, never to return. The traditional approach to this problem focuses on creating jobs and improving amenities, she said. But we think the real issue is deeper than economics. Young people leave communities where they don't feel needed, where they don't have opportunities to contribute in meaningful ways. She looked around the room, her voice carrying conviction that surprised even Tommy with its strength. "What we're proposing is a community development strategy based on the idea that everyone has something valuable to offer, regardless of age or experience level. A place where 7-year-olds can teach high schoolers about creativity, where teenagers can help senior citizens navigate new technology, where young adults can learn business skills by managing community programs." As Amy returned to her seat, Tommy approached the podium for the final portion of their presentation. "The senior class has presented a vision of Brooksville as a place that attracts people through economic opportunity," he said. "That's important, and we support those goals. But we want to offer a complementary vision, Brooksville as a place that keeps people through emotional connection, through the sense that they belong to something larger than themselves." Tommy felt his nervousness evaporate as he spoke about the ideas that had been crystallizing in his mind for weeks. "We envision a community where leadership development starts in elementary school and continues throughout people's lives, where local businesses partner with schools not just to hire graduates, but to create learning opportunities that benefit both students and employers, where arts and culture aren't luxuries added after economic needs are met, but essential components of what makes a place worth calling home." He paused, looking at faces that seemed genuinely engaged with what he was saying. "The Arts Festival we organized 3 weeks ago served 200 elementary students and involved 75 high schoolers. But more importantly, it created relationships and experiences that will influence how those young people think about community for the rest of their lives. Some of the elementary students who participated are already asking when they'll be old enough to help teach younger children. Some of the high schoolers are talking about careers in education or community service, that they never considered before. Tommy's voice grew stronger as he approached his conclusion. We're not just proposing programs and initiatives. We're proposing a fundamental shift in how Brooksville thinks about human potential. The idea that everyone has gifts to offer and something to learn from others, regardless of their age or position in society. As Tommy returned to his seat, the room was quiet in a way that felt different from the polite attention the senior presentation had received. The silence felt charged, expectant, as though the judges were processing ideas that had genuinely surprised them. The question period that followed was intense but encouraging. Judge after judge asked for specific details about implementation, funding, evaluation measures, but they also asked deeper questions about philosophy and long-term vision that suggested they were taking the junior class's proposals seriously as potential policy initiatives. "Mr. Carter," said Mrs. Elizabeth Morrison, the school board president, "you've described a community development approach that's quite different from traditional economic development strategies. What makes you confident that this kind of programming can produce measurable results?" Tommy stood to answer, feeling more comfortable now that he was discussing ideas he had lived through rather than theoretical possibilities. "Mrs. Morrison, 3 weeks ago, most of the high schoolers on my team had never worked directly with elementary students. Today, several of them are volunteering as regular tutors, and 2 are seriously considering education as career paths. The elementary students who participated have shown improved reading scores and increased enthusiasm for school generally." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But more importantly, we've seen changes in how people relate to each other throughout the school. Students who used to exist in separate social groups are working together on projects. Younger students look up to older ones, not just as athletes or popular kids, but as mentors and teachers. That's the kind of social capital that makes communities strong." Judge after judge posed questions, and Tommy found himself responding with confidence he hadn't known he possessed. His teammates contributed insights and details, creating a conversation that felt more like collaborative problem-solving than formal questioning. When the session ended, both teams were dismissed while the judges deliberated. Tommy and his teammates found themselves in the hallway, emotionally drained but oddly exhilarated. "That went well," Mary Catherine said, though her voice carried the uncertainty that comes after intense performances when you're not sure if your best effort was good enough. "Better than well," Susan replied. "I think we actually surprised them. Some of those questions suggested they're seriously considering implementing our ideas regardless of who wins the competition." Tommy nodded, but found himself thinking about something beyond the immediate results of the presentation. Over the past month, he had discovered capabilities and interests he hadn't known he possessed. He had learned that his instinct to listen carefully and consider multiple perspectives could be valuable leadership tools. Most importantly, he had experienced the satisfaction that comes from helping turn good ideas into positive reality. Whatever the judges decided, Tommy knew he had found something worth pursuing for the rest of his life. After 30 minutes that felt like hours, both teams were called back into the library. The judges sat with expressions that gave no hint of their decision, and Superintendent Miller approached the podium with the kind of formal bearing that suggested momentous announcements. "I want to begin by saying that both presentations were exceptional," he said. "The senior class offered a comprehensive, well-researched economic development strategy that demonstrates sophisticated understanding of community growth challenges. The junior class offered an innovative approach to human capital development that could complement traditional economic strategies in powerful ways." Tommy's heart hammered against his ribs as Superintendent Miller continued. "This decision was not easy, and the margin was closer than you might expect. Both teams demonstrated leadership, creativity, and genuine commitment to community service." He paused, and the silence stretched uncomfortably. "However, one presentation offered something we hadn't seen before, a vision that was not only innovative, but had already been tested and proven effective. A proposal that demonstrated practical results while pointing toward possibilities that could transform how our community thinks about education, civic engagement, and human potential." Tommy felt Susan's hand find his under the table, her fingers intertwining with his, in a gesture of support that sent electricity through his entire nervous system. "The winner of the first annual inter-class competition is," The junior class. The room erupted in applause, but Tommy barely heard it over the roaring in his ears. They had won. Somehow, impossibly, they had won. But even more importantly, as he looked around at the faces of the judges, faces that showed not just approval but excitement about the ideas they had presented, Tommy understood that this victory was really just a beginning. Mrs. Morrison approached their table as the applause died down. "Mr. Carter, I want you to know that the school board will be discussing your proposals at our next meeting. We are particularly interested in developing a pilot program for the mentorship initiatives you described." "Mrs. Morrison," Tommy said, standing to shake her hand, "we'd be honored to help with implementation in any way we can." "I'm counting on it," she replied with a smile. "Good ideas are valuable, but good ideas combined with people willing to do the work to make them reality, that's how communities change for the better." As the judges filed out and the formal ceremony concluded, Tommy found himself surrounded by teammates, parents, teachers, and classmates offering congratulations. But through the crowd, he caught sight of Brad Wellington approaching. "Congratulations," Brad said, extending his hand. "That was an impressive presentation. You guys earned this." "Thanks, Brad. Your team's proposal was really strong, too. I hope some of those economic development ideas get implemented, regardless of the competition results." Brad nodded. "Maybe that's the real lesson here. Competition can bring out everyone's best work, but community building requires collaboration." As the crowd began to disperse, Tommy found himself alone with his teammates and their families. Helen was crying happy tears. Frank was grinning with the kind of pride that comes from watching your child exceed every expectation, and Joey was bouncing around like he had personally won the lottery. "So what happens now?" Amy asked. "Now we go home and celebrate," Susan said, "and on Monday we start figuring out how to turn everything we talked about today into reality." "You realize," Mary Catherine added with a journalist's instinct for the bigger picture, "that we just committed ourselves to actually doing all the things we proposed. This isn't the end of our responsibility, it's the beginning." Tommy looked around at his teammates, people who had started the semester as acquaintances and had become genuine friends through shared work and common purpose, and felt something settle into place in his chest. A sense of belonging, of purpose, of readiness for whatever challenges lay ahead. "I can't think of anything I'd rather spend my time doing," he said. As they walked out of the school together, October evening settling over Brooksville with the kind of golden light that makes ordinary moments feel significant, Tommy realized that the competition had given him something more valuable than recognition or scholarship opportunities. It had given him a clear sense of who he was meant to become. That night, Tommy sat at his desk with a letter he had started writing but couldn't seem to finish. At the top of the page, he had written, "Dear future me," but the words that followed felt inadequate to capture everything that had happened over the past month. How do you explain to your future self the moment when you discovered that your voice mattered? How do you preserve the feeling of standing in front of a room full of adults and realizing they were actually listening to your ideas, taking them seriously, planning to act on them? Instead of continuing with the letter, Tommy pulled out his notebook and began writing what felt more like a story. October 15th, 1966. Today I learned that the most important changes in life don't announce themselves with fanfare or dramatic gestures. They happen quietly, in moments when you decide to raise your hand instead of staying silent, to step forward instead of holding back, to believe that your ideas might be worth sharing with the world. A month ago, I was Tommy Carter, the quiet kid who preferred watching from the sidelines. Tonight I'm still Tommy Carter, but somehow that name means something different now. It means someone who listens carefully and speaks thoughtfully. Someone who understands that real leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about asking the right questions and creating space for other people to contribute their best thinking. The competition is over, but the work is just beginning. On Monday, we'll start planning the expansion of the Arts Festival, developing the mentorship program, figuring out how to turn good intentions into sustainable reality. It won't be easy, and we'll probably make mistakes, but I'm not afraid of that anymore. I used to think courage meant not being scared. Now I think it means being scared and showing up anyway, trusting that the work itself will teach you whatever you need to know. Tommy paused in his writing, hearing voices from downstairs, his parents discussing the day's events over coffee, their words carrying the kind of quiet satisfaction that comes from watching someone you love discover their potential. He looked around his room at the familiar objects that had witnessed his childhood and adolescence. The baseball trophies from Little League, the books he had read and reread, the photographs of family vacations and school events. Everything looked the same, but somehow he saw it all differently now, not as artifacts of who he had been, but as foundation stones for who he was becoming. Outside his window, Brooksville was settling into its evening rhythm. Porch lights were coming on, families were gathering for dinner, and somewhere in the distance the Friday night football game was probably reaching its climax under lights that turned the autumn air magical. It was the same town he had known all his life, but Tommy understood now that he had been seeing only part of its story. He had been thinking of Brooksville as a place he would eventually leave, a launching pad for whatever came after high school. But tonight, for the first time, he could imagine staying, not because he lacked ambition or courage to explore the wider world, but because he had discovered something worth building here. The phone rang downstairs, and a few minutes later, Helen called up that Susan was on the line. Tommy's heart did its familiar skip as he picked up the extension. "Hi, Susan." "Hi, Tommy. I hope I'm not calling too late. I wanted to talk about today, about everything that's happened. I've been thinking about it too. It still doesn't feel completely real. I know what you mean. This morning we were just high school students competing in a school contest. Tonight, we're apparently community development consultants with real responsibilities to real people." Tommy could hear the mixture of excitement and anxiety in her voice, the same combination he was feeling. "Are you scared?" he asked. "Terrified," Susan admitted, "but also more excited than I've ever been about anything. We have a chance to actually make a difference, Tommy, to create something that will outlast our time in high school, something that will benefit people we may never meet." They talked for nearly an hour, processing the day's events and beginning to plan for the work ahead. As they spoke, Tommy found himself thinking about how much had changed in their relationship over the past month. Susan was no longer just the girl he had a crush on, the popular classmate who seemed to exist in a different orbit from his own. She had become a genuine friend, a collaborator, someone who understood his ideas and helped make them better. "Tommy," Susan said, as their conversation was winding down, "can I tell you something?" "Of course. When I nominated you for class representative that first day, I thought I was just being encouraging, helping a nice guy step out of his comfort zone. I had no idea I was watching someone discover they were born to be a leader." Tommy felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Susan, let me finish. What you've accomplished this month, the way you've brought people together and turned ideas into reality, it's been amazing to watch. But more than that, you've shown all of us what's possible when someone cares more about the work than about getting credit for it." She paused, and Tommy could hear something different in her voice, something that made his pulse accelerate. "I'm proud to be your friend, Tommy Carter, and I'm excited to see what you do next." After they hung up, Tommy returned to his notebook and continued writing. "I used to think the most important question was, what do I want to be when I grow up? But I think the real question is, how do I want to contribute to the world while I'm here?" The answer doesn't have to be grand or dramatic. Sometimes the most meaningful contributions are the simple ones, listening to someone who needs to be heard, creating opportunities for others to succeed, building connections between people who might otherwise remain strangers. Tonight I know something I didn't know this morning. The voice I've been hearing in my head, the one that notices things other people miss and cares about things that might seem small, isn't something I need to outgrow or overcome. It's exactly what the world needs from me. Tommy closed the notebook and prepared for bed, but before turning off his desk lamp, he looked once more at the construction paper flower Susan had tucked into his shirt pocket during the arts festival. It was slightly wilted now, the bright tempera paint beginning to fade, but it remained beautiful in its imperfection. He carefully pressed the flower between the pages of his notebook, preserving it not as a memento of victory, but as a reminder of something Susan had said about the most beautiful things being made with love by people who aren't worried about perfection. As he settled into bed, Tommy Carter, student body representative, community development consultant, quiet kid who had found his voice, reflected on how dramatically his world had expanded in just 30 days. The boy who had started September worrying about whether anyone would notice him was ending October with adults asking for his ideas about shaping the future of his community. But perhaps the most profound change wasn't in how others saw him, but in how he saw himself. He was no longer someone waiting for permission to matter, no longer someone who assumed that important work was done by other people. He was someone who had learned that the most significant changes often begin with ordinary people who decide they care enough to try. Outside his window, Brooksville slept peacefully under October stars, unaware that one of its sons had just committed himself to a lifetime of trying to make it, and places like it, a little bit better for everyone who called it home. Tommy smiled in the darkness, thinking about Monday morning and the work that lay ahead. There would be meetings to organize, programs to develop, problems to solve, and probably failures to learn from. But for the first time in his life, he was eager rather than anxious about unknown challenges. He had discovered that the most powerful force in the world might not be courage or intelligence or talent, but something simpler and more available to everyone. The decision to care deeply about something beyond yourself, and the willingness to do the work, however small, however imperfect, to make it better. In 3 years, Tommy Carter would graduate as valedictorian of Brooksville High School's class of 1969. He would accept a full scholarship to study education and community development at the State University, but not before spending a gap year helping to establish the intergenerational programming that had grown from the Arts Festival into a model replicated by school districts across Illinois. He would return to Brooksville 5 years later as the district's youngest ever superintendent, implementing innovations that would make the town a destination for young families seeking communities that invested in all their residents. He would marry Susan McKinley in the same gymnasium where they had organized the Arts Festival, and they would raise 3 children who would grow up believing that their voices mattered and their ideas could change the world. But all of that lay in the future, invisible and unplanned. Tonight, Tommy Carter was simply a 16-year-old boy who had learned that the most important adventures don't require leaving home. They require finding the courage to see home clearly and love it enough to make it better. He closed his eyes and dreamed of arts festivals and mentorship programs, of town meetings where teenagers' ideas were taken seriously, of a community where every generation had something to teach and something to learn. He dreamed of simple things that turned out to be the most important things of all: connection, belonging, the quiet satisfaction of work that matters. And in his dreams, he could hear the sound of children's laughter mixing with teenagers' voices, the scratch of paintbrushes on paper, and the gentle percussion of young people building something beautiful together, the sound of a community discovering what it could become when everyone's gifts were welcomed and everyone's potential was believed in. It was the sound of home becoming everything it had always promised to be, one simple act of caring at a time.